100 men entered the Yazoo Delta with rifles, dogs, and an unshakable confidence that their numbers would guarantee victory. They were hunting a single slave named Abraham Cole, a man they called the 7-foot giant. 3 weeks later, their weapons lay scattered in the mud, rusted and abandoned. But the bodies, all 100 of them, were never found. What happened in those swamps became a legend that plantation owners refused to speak about, a story that slaves whispered in the quarters when the masters slept, and a warning that echoed through Mississippi for generations to come. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The story of Abraham Cole began long before that fateful hunt in the Yazoo Delta, back when he was just another nameless slave working the cotton fields of the Whitaker plantation in 1854 Mississippi. The summer heat that year was particularly brutal, the kind that made the air shimmer above the endless rows of white cotton bolls and turned the red dirt into cracked patterns that resembled dried blood. Abraham was 26 years old then, already standing at an imposing 7 feet and 2 inches tall, with shoulders so broad that other slaves joked he could carry 2 full cotton sacks at once without breaking stride. His skin was the deep brown of rich Mississippi soil, marked with scars that told stories he never spoke aloud, and his eyes held something that made even the overseers uncomfortable when they looked too long, a kind of quiet defiance that suggested he was merely biding his time. Colonel James Whitaker owned 3 plantations across the Delta region, controlling more than 400 slaves and commanding respect through fear and ruthless efficiency. He was a man in his late 50s with silver hair, a neatly trimmed beard, and the kind of cold blue eyes that could make grown men look away. Whitaker had inherited his first plantation from his father and built his empire through calculated marriages and strategic land acquisitions during the economic boom of the 1840s. He considered himself a sophisticated man, well-read and cultured, often hosting gatherings where wealthy planters would discuss politics, philosophy, and the economics of slavery over imported brandy and Cuban cigars. But beneath that veneer of sophistication lurked a cruelty that was almost scientific in its precision, a willingness to inflict pain not out of rage, but out of cold calculation designed to maintain absolute control. Abraham Cole came to the Whitaker plantation through an auction in Natchez when he was 16 years old, bought specifically because of his size and the promise of the physical labor he could provide. His mother had been sold away when he was 12, his father before that, and he had learned early that survival meant keeping your head down, your mouth shut, and your thoughts to yourself. For 10 years he did exactly that, working from dawn until well past dusk, eating whatever scraps were provided, sleeping in the cramped quarters with 40 other men, and enduring the daily humiliations that came with being considered property rather than human. But something changed in Abraham during that 10th year, something that the other slaves noticed first in the way he held himself, then in the way he began to speak, quietly at first, about freedom and dignity and the fundamental wrongness of their situation. It started with small acts of resistance. Abraham would deliberately slow his pace in the fields when the overseers weren't looking, encouraging others to do the same. He would redistribute food in the quarters so that the sick and elderly got more than their share. He began teaching the younger slaves to read using a tattered Bible he had found hidden in the rafters of the barn, conducting secret lessons by candlelight long after the masters assumed everyone was asleep. The knowledge spread slowly, carefully, with each newly literate slave understanding that discovery would mean severe punishment or death. Abraham told them that education was the first step toward freedom, that understanding the written word meant understanding the laws that enslaved them, and perhaps one day, the documents that might set them free. The overseers sensed something was changing in the quarters, but couldn't quite identify the source. The slaves still worked, still followed orders, but there was a new energy among them, a subtle shift in dynamics that made the white men uneasy. They increased patrols, implemented stricter curfews, and punished minor infractions with increased severity, trying to reassert control through fear. But the spark that Abraham had ignited continued to grow, spreading to other plantations through the underground networks that slaves had developed over generations, passed along in songs, in coded conversations, in the brief moments when workers from different estates would cross paths. The breaking point came on a sweltering August afternoon when an overseer named Clayton Briggs decided to make an example of an elderly slave named Joseph who had collapsed in the fields from heat exhaustion. Briggs was a cruel man even by the standards of that brutal time, taking genuine pleasure in inflicting pain and viewing the slaves as little more than animals that needed to be broken and controlled. He began whipping Joseph as the old man lay helpless on the ground, counting out lashes with a methodical rhythm while the other slaves were forced to watch as a lesson in obedience. By the 20th lash, Joseph had lost consciousness. By the 30th, several slaves were crying, begging Briggs to stop. But he continued, a twisted smile on his face, determined to reach 50. Abraham Cole stepped forward before he fully realized what he was doing. His massive frame cast a shadow over Briggs as he grabbed the overseer's arm mid-swing, stopping the whip in midair with a grip that made Briggs gasp in pain. The entire field went silent, every slave and overseer frozen by the unprecedented act of direct resistance. For a long moment, Abraham and Briggs stood there, connected by the slave's hand on the white man's arm, and in that moment the old order that had governed the plantation for decades shattered like dropped glass. Briggs recovered first, yanking his arm away and backing up with a mixture of shock and rage contorting his features. He screamed for the other overseers, and within minutes, 6 armed men had surrounded Abraham. The enslaved workers scattered, some running for the quarters while others simply dropped to their knees, knowing that what was about to happen would be terrible and wanting no association with the act of rebellion. Abraham stood his ground, making no move toward violence, but refusing to bow or beg, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the plantation boundaries, as if he could see the freedom he had often spoken about in his secret lessons. They dragged Abraham to the whipping post in the center of the plantation, the same post where countless slaves had been punished before him, its wood stained dark from years of blood. Colonel Whitaker himself came down from the main house, alerted by the commotion and understanding instinctively that this was a moment that would define the future of his enterprise. He ordered 100 lashes, a punishment that few men survived, delivered not all at once, but spread over 3 days to maximize the suffering and the lesson it would teach. The colonel wanted every slave on the plantation to understand the cost of defiance, to witness what happened when one of their own dared to raise a hand against a white man. Abraham Cole endured those 3 days in a way that became the foundation of his legend. He never cried out during the whippings, never begged for mercy, never even acknowledged the pain that must have been excruciating beyond imagination. Between sessions, they left him tied to the post under the merciless sun, without water or food, his back a ruined mass of torn flesh that attracted flies and festered in the heat. Other slaves would sneak close during the night, bringing water when they could, whispering prayers and songs of encouragement, terrified but unable to abandon him completely. On the morning of the 4th day, when the overseers came to cut him down, expecting to find a corpse or at least a broken man, Abraham Cole raised his head and looked directly at Colonel Whitaker with eyes that burned with such intensity that the wealthy planter took an involuntary step backward. They threw Abraham in the punishment cells, a series of tiny wooden boxes barely large enough for a man to crouch in, let alone someone of his immense size. He stayed there for 2 weeks, given just enough food and water to keep him alive, his wounds growing infected, his body cramped into impossible positions. The other slaves were forbidden from speaking his name, and Whitaker spread word that Abraham Cole would serve as a permanent example, that he would spend the rest of his days in the harshest labor, that his spirit would be completely broken before another month had passed. But when they finally dragged Abraham from the cell, carrying him because his legs could barely support his weight after the confinement, those same eyes still held that fierce light, that unbreakable core that suggested his body might be enslaved, but his mind remained free. The plantation changed after that. The slaves had witnessed something they had never seen before, proof that the system that oppressed them could be resisted, that one of their own could endure the worst punishments the masters could devise and still retain his humanity and dignity. Abraham Cole became more than just a man. He became a symbol, and symbols are dangerous things because they inspire people to imagine different possibilities, to question the structures that define their reality. Whitaker understood this instinctively and realized that as long as Abraham remained on the plantation, His very presence would undermine the absolute authority the colonel needed to maintain control. The decision to sell Abraham came from both practical and vengeful motivations. Whitaker could have simply had him killed, and many of his peers advised exactly that. But the colonel was too shrewd for such a straightforward solution. He knew that killing Abraham would make him a martyr, that the story would spread to other plantations and potentially inspire more resistance. Instead, he decided to sell Abraham to Cyrus Hammond, a plantation owner in the deeper Delta regions who was infamous for his brutality and who specialized in breaking difficult slaves through methods that made other owners uncomfortable. Hammond operated what was essentially a private prison, taking on slaves that other planters couldn't control and using systematic torture, starvation, and psychological warfare to destroy their spirits before reselling them as compliant workers. Abraham Cole spent 6 months on Hammond's plantation, enduring conditions that were medieval in their cruelty. Hammond used isolation, sleep deprivation, and calculated humiliation to break his slaves, keeping them in a constant state of terror and confusion. He would occasionally show kindness, offering extra food or a day of rest, only to follow it with sudden, explosive violence that kept the slaves unable to predict what would happen next, a technique designed to create learned helplessness and complete dependence on their captors' whims. But Abraham had developed something during his years of quiet resistance, a mental fortress that Hammond's techniques couldn't penetrate. He would retreat into his mind during the worst moments, reciting the Bible verses he had memorized, thinking about the students he had taught to read, remembering his mother's face and the stories she had told him about their ancestors who had been free. The breaking point with Hammond came when Abraham defended another slave, a teenage boy named Marcus who Hammond had decided to use as an example after the youth had been caught stealing food. Hammond's method was to force the other slaves to participate in punishments, creating collective guilt and breaking the bonds of solidarity that might otherwise develop. He ordered Abraham to whip Marcus, knowing that forcing the giant man to inflict pain on another slave would damage the moral authority that made Abraham dangerous. It was a calculated move, the kind of psychological manipulation that Hammond had perfected over years of breaking difficult slaves. Abraham refused. He stood in the center of Hammond's yard with 20 armed overseers surrounding him and said one word, spoken quietly but with absolute finality. No. Hammond flew into a rage, screaming orders, threatening death, promising tortures that would last for weeks. Abraham simply stood there, that same distant look in his eyes, as if he had already made peace with whatever consequences would follow. Hammond realized in that moment that he had failed, that Abraham Cole was unbreakable, and that keeping him on the plantation would only inspire other slaves to similar defiance. Within a week, Abraham was back on the auction block in Natchez, sold at a loss to a buyer from a smaller plantation near the Yazoo River. But something had changed in the broader landscape of Mississippi slavery by then. The stories about Abraham Cole had spread through the slave networks, growing with each retelling. He was the man who had stood up to the overseers, who had survived 100 lashes, who had endured Hammond's hell and emerged with his spirit intact. Plantation owners began to hear whispers about the 7-foot giant, a name that had emerged from the quarters and taken on mythological proportions. Some owners dismissed it as nonsense, the kind of folklore that slaves had always created to give themselves hope in hopeless situations. Others, the smarter and more perceptive ones, recognized that Abraham Cole represented a genuine threat to the entire system of slavery in the region, that his existence proved resistance was possible and survival was achievable. Colonel Whitaker heard these stories and understood that his decision to sell Abraham rather than kill him had been a catastrophic mistake. The giant slave had become something more dangerous than one man. He had become an idea, a living example that the absolute power of slave owners could be challenged. Whitaker began to obsess over Abraham, tracking his movements from plantation to plantation, hearing about each new act of quiet defiance, each whispered conversation in the slave quarters, each time Abraham's presence inspired others to small acts of resistance. The colonel came to believe that as long as Abraham Cole lived, the entire institution of slavery in Mississippi was threatened, that his very existence encouraged slaves to imagine freedom and gave them hope that the current order might one day change. In the spring of 1855, Abraham Cole disappeared from the plantation where he had been working. The circumstances were never entirely clear. Some said he simply walked away during a night when the overseers were distracted by a fire in one of the barns. Others claimed he had help from the Underground Railroad, that network of abolitionists and sympathetic individuals who helped slaves escape to the north. Still others whispered that he had killed several overseers in his escape, though no bodies were ever found to confirm this version. What was certain was that Abraham Cole, the 7-foot giant, was no longer in chains, and that his escape represented a fundamental challenge to the entire system that Colonel Whitaker and men like him had built their fortunes upon. The colonel's response was swift and overwhelming. He placed a reward on Abraham's capture, an extraordinary sum of $5,000, more money than most people in Mississippi would see in their entire lives. The announcement spread through the region like wildfire, drawing the attention of every bounty hunter, slave catcher, and opportunistic criminal within 300 miles. Whitaker made it clear that he wanted Abraham returned alive if possible, but dead was acceptable, and that the reward would be paid immediately upon proof of capture or death. He used his considerable influence to pressure other plantation owners to contribute to the reward, arguing that Abraham Cole represented a threat to all of them, that his successful escape would inspire countless other slaves to attempt the same thing. The bounty hunters began arriving within days, rough men from across the South who specialized in tracking escaped slaves. They brought dogs bred for human hunting, weapons ranging from rifles to bullwhips, and a combination of tracking skills and ruthless determination that had made them successful in their grim profession. Among them was Nathaniel Price, a man in his mid-40s who had built a reputation as the most successful slave catcher in the Deep South. Price was tall and lean, with cold gray eyes and a face weathered by years of outdoor pursuit. He dressed better than most bounty hunters, wearing tailored clothes and carrying expensive weapons, the visible signs of a lucrative career built on human suffering. Price had caught hundreds of escaped slaves over his 20-year career, tracking them through swamps and forests, across state lines, even into free territories where he operated in legal gray areas that tended to favor men willing to use violence. He approached slave catching as a science, studying terrain, understanding human psychology, anticipating the choices that desperate people would make when running for their lives. He had never failed to catch a target, a perfect record that he guarded jealously and that had made him wealthy beyond what most men in his profession could imagine. The reward on Abraham Cole was more than double what Price usually earned for a capture, but more importantly, catching the 7-foot giant would cement his legacy as the greatest slave catcher who ever lived. Price quickly realized that he couldn't catch Abraham alone. The giant slave had a 3-week head start, and Price's sources suggested that Abraham was moving through the Yazoo Delta, one of the most difficult terrains in Mississippi. The Delta was a vast expanse of swamps, bayous, and dense forests, a primordial landscape where water and land blurred together, where massive cypress trees draped with Spanish moss created a canopy so thick that sunlight barely reached the ground. It was home to alligators, water moccasins, and clouds of mosquitoes that could drive a man mad, a place where the geography itself seemed designed to swallow people who didn't know its secrets. More importantly, the Delta had always been a haven for escaped slaves, offering places to hide that even the most skilled trackers struggled to navigate, and populated by small communities of free blacks and sympathetic individuals who would help fugitives rather than turn them in. Price began recruiting other bounty hunters, proposing a coalition that would split the reward but maximize their chances of success. He argued that Abraham's size and the stories about his endurance meant that a single hunter or even a small group would be at a disadvantage, that they needed overwhelming force to guarantee capture. His reputation and his promise of organized planning attracted men from across the region. They came from Louisiana, Arkansas, Tennessee, and even as far as Texas, drawn by the enormous reward and the challenge of catching a target who had become legendary. Within 2 weeks, Price had assembled 99 other bounty hunters, creating a small army dedicated to one purpose. The coalition that Price built was as diverse as it was deadly. There were professional slave catchers like himself, men who had spent years perfecting their craft and who viewed hunting humans as simply another job. There were plantation overseers looking to supplement their income and prove their worth to their employers. There were criminals and outlaws who saw the reward as a chance to make more money than they could steal in a year of robberies. There were young men seeking adventure and reputation, viewing the hunt as a chance to prove their manhood and courage. And there were men driven by pure racial hatred, who volunteered for the hunt not because of the money, but because they wanted to put an escaped slave back in chains or into the ground. Price organized them with military precision. He divided the 100 hunters into 10 groups of 10 men each, with experienced trackers leading each squad. He obtained detailed maps of the Yazoo Delta from the few white men who had extensively explored the region. He negotiated with local plantation owners for supplies, boats, and information about slave movements in the area. He established a base camp at the northern edge of the Delta, where the Yazoo River met slightly higher ground, and from their coordinated search patterns designed to sweep through the swamps systematically. Price's plan was simple but theoretically effective. Create a net so wide that Abraham Cole couldn't possibly slip through, then slowly tighten that net until the giant slave was trapped with nowhere left to run. The 100 bounty hunters entered the Yazoo Delta on a humid morning in early June 1855. They moved in their assigned groups, spread across a 15-mile front, communicating through rifle shots and horn signals. Each group had at least one man with tracking dogs, the vicious hounds baying and straining at their leashes as they searched for human scent. The hunters were confident, joking among themselves about how they would spend their share of the reward, making bets about which group would make the actual capture. Many had never worked with such a large force before, and there was a sense of invincibility that came from being part of a 100-strong army hunting a single man, even if that man was the legendary 7-foot giant. The first 3 days of the hunt produced promising signs. Several groups found evidence of recent camps, places where fires had been built and fish had been cleaned. They discovered broken branches at heights that suggested someone unusually tall had passed through. Local slaves, questioned under threat of punishment, admitted to hearing about a giant man moving through the Delta, though they claimed not to know his exact location. Price felt the familiar excitement of a successful hunt beginning to build, the sense that his quarry was close and that it was only a matter of time before the net closed. He sent messages to Colonel Whitaker, assuring the wealthy planter that Abraham Cole would be in chains within a week. But the Delta was vast beyond what even Price had fully appreciated, and Abraham Cole knew its secrets in ways that none of the hunters could match. During his months of moving through the region, Abraham had connected with communities of escaped slaves and free blacks who lived in the deepest, most inaccessible parts of the swamps. These were people who had carved out hidden lives in a hostile world, building stilt houses deep in the bayous where no white man would think to look, surviving on fish, game, and small gardens planted on scattered patches of solid ground. They had learned to read the swamp's moods, to navigate by subtle signs that outsiders would never notice, to move silently through water and mud without leaving tracks. And they remembered the stories about Abraham Cole, the giant slave who had endured and resisted, and they welcomed him not just as a fugitive, but as a symbol of what they all aspired to be. These communities warned Abraham about the bounty hunters the moment the coalition entered the Delta. Their network of communication was sophisticated, using bird calls, marked trees, and hidden messages to relay information faster than any white man would believe possible. Abraham learned about Price's military-style organization, about the division of the hunters into groups, about their planned search patterns. And slowly, a plan began to form in Abraham's mind, something that went beyond simple evasion or hiding. He understood that as long as this massive hunting party was in the Delta searching for him, he would never be truly safe, that Colonel Whitaker would simply send more hunters if this group failed. The only way to achieve any kind of lasting freedom was to make the price of hunting him so high that no one would ever try again. Abraham began to hunt the hunters. He started with isolated individuals, men who wandered too far from their groups or who lagged behind during the difficult passages through the swamp. The first to vanish was a bounty hunter named Caleb Drummond, a cruel man from Arkansas who had caught dozens of slaves and was known for the sadistic pleasure he took in his work. Drummond disappeared on the 4th night of the hunt, last seen relieving himself at the edge of his camp. His group searched for him at dawn, finding nothing but his rifle leaning against a tree and boot prints that led to the water, and then simply stopped. They assumed he had stumbled into quicksand or been taken by an alligator, tragedies that were common enough in the Delta, and continued their search for Abraham with slightly diminished enthusiasm. The second disappearance came the following day. Two hunters from different groups, both experienced trackers, vanished within hours of each other. Their camps found signs of brief struggles, overturned equipment, but no bodies, no blood, nothing that explained what had happened to grown men armed with rifles and knives. The hunting parties began to grow nervous, their earlier confidence replaced by a creeping unease that something was wrong. Price gathered the remaining hunters and lectured them about staying together, maintaining discipline, not wandering from their groups. He insisted that the disappearances were coincidental, that the Delta was dangerous, and that they needed to be more careful. But privately, Price was beginning to suspect that Abraham Cole was not simply hiding from them, but actively fighting back. Over the next 2 weeks, the hunters continued to disappear. Sometimes it was individuals who made the mistake of separating from their groups. Sometimes it was entire patrols, 10 men who would be there one morning and gone by nightfall, leaving behind their weapons and supplies, but no indication of what had happened to them. The tracking dogs would sometimes lead search parties to water's edge and then refuse to go further, whining and pulling back from something they sensed but that the humans couldn't detect. The hunters began to fracture, their military organization breaking down as fear and suspicion grew. Men accused each other of desertion or cowardice. Fights broke out over diminishing supplies and fraying nerves, and Price found it increasingly difficult to maintain control over a coalition that had started with such confidence. Abraham moved through the Delta like a ghost, using knowledge that the swamp communities had taught him and skills he had developed during his years of surviving impossible conditions. He was patient, watching the hunters from concealed positions, learning their patterns, waiting for the right moments to strike. He used the terrain against them, leading groups into quicksand pits or areas with particularly aggressive alligators. He contaminated their water supplies with substances that wouldn't kill, but would leave men sick and weakened. He created false trails that led hunting parties in circles until they were hopelessly lost and had to abandon their equipment to find their way back to civilization. And when he encountered hunters alone or in small numbers, he confronted them directly. His massive size and the reputation he carried often enough to make armed men flee without ever firing a shot. But it wasn't just physical intimidation that made Abraham so effective. He had learned during his years in slavery to understand the psychology of the men who oppressed him, to recognize their weaknesses and fears. He left signs for the hunters to find, messages that played on their growing terror. Abandoned camps would be discovered with all the men's weapons arranged in perfect circles around cold fire pits. Groups would wake to find symbols carved into trees surrounding their camps, African markings that none of them recognized, but that somehow conveyed menace. The hunters began to tell each other stories, rumors that grew with each retelling, about how the 7-foot giant could move through water without making ripples, how he could see in complete darkness, how his hands were strong enough to snap rifles in half and crush skulls like eggs. Nathaniel Price, for all his experience and previous success, found himself facing something he had never encountered before. Every other slave he had hunted had been running away, trying to escape, focused entirely on survival and evasion. Abraham Cole was different. He was staying in the Delta, deliberately engaging with a force that outnumbered him 100 to 1, and somehow winning. Price's perfect record, his reputation as an unstoppable tracker, all of it was crumbling in the humid heat of the Yazoo swamps. He sent desperate messages back to Colonel Whitaker, requesting more men, better weapons, military support. But even as he made these requests, Price understood that the problem wasn't lack of resources. It was that he was hunting someone who had become something more than human in the minds of both the hunters and the hunted. The psychological warfare that Abraham waged was perhaps even more effective than the physical elimination of the hunters. The remaining bounty hunters became paranoid, seeing threats in every shadow, interpreting ordinary swamp sounds as evidence of the 7-foot giant's approach. They stopped sleeping, their exhaustion making them careless and prone to mistakes. They began to turn on each other, suspecting that some among them might be sympathetic to Abraham or even actively helping him. Several hunters simply deserted, deciding that no amount of money was worth what they were experiencing. Others went mad, their minds breaking under the constant stress and fear, babbling about a giant shadow that followed them through the trees, about eyes watching from the darkness, about an inhuman presence that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. By the beginning of the third week, fewer than 40 hunters remained in the Delta, and these were either the most stubborn, the most desperate, or the most foolish. Price had long since abandoned his organized search patterns, instead consolidating his remaining men into a defensive position near their base camp, hoping that Abraham would make a mistake or that reinforcements would arrive. But Abraham had no intention of making a direct assault. He had already won, had already demonstrated that the cost of hunting him was far higher than any reward could justify. The remaining hunters were trapped not by physical barriers, but by their own fear, unable to effectively search for their quarry, unable to retreat without admitting defeat, slowly being consumed by the Delta's oppressive environment and their own deteriorating mental states. The end came not with a climactic battle, but with a quiet dissolution. On the morning of the 22nd day of the hunt, a small group of plantation owners and local authorities arrived at Price's base camp, summoned by his increasingly desperate messages. They found the camp abandoned, supplies scattered, weapons left where they had been dropped. There was no sign of violence, no bodies, no blood, just the evidence that men had been there and then had left in a hurry. Following the trails, search parties eventually found some of the hunters wandering the edges of the Delta, their minds shattered, unable to coherently explain what they had experienced. They spoke in fragments about darkness and silence, about a giant who could be everywhere at once, about watching their companions vanish into the swamp without a sound. Over the following weeks, a few more hunters straggled out of the Delta, but most were never seen again. Nathaniel Price was among those who disappeared completely, his legendary career ending somewhere in the Yazoo swamps, his perfect record broken not by a missed capture, but by becoming prey himself. The weapons and equipment of 100 bounty hunters were eventually recovered, found scattered across dozens of locations throughout the Delta, but the bodies were never found. Some people theorized that quicksand or alligators had claimed them, but those explanations couldn't account for the sheer number of disappearances or the organized way that the weapons had been left behind, almost as if they had been deliberately collected and placed as markers. Abraham Cole was never captured. The reward that Colonel Whitaker had placed on him remained unclaimed, and no other bounty hunter was foolish enough to try what 100 men had failed to accomplish. The colonel himself became something of a tragic figure, his obsession with Abraham destroying his health and eventually his fortune as he spent vast sums trying to track the escaped slave. Whitaker died in 1859, reportedly still muttering about the 7-foot giant with his last breaths, his empire divided among relatives who wanted nothing to do with the slave who had haunted their kinsman's final years. The legend of Abraham Cole spread throughout the South during the years leading up to the Civil War. In the slave quarters of 1,000 plantations, his story was told and retold, growing with each iteration but maintaining its core truth, that one man had stood up to the system that oppressed millions and had not only survived but triumphed. To the slaves, Abraham became a symbol of resistance and hope, proof that the absolute power of their masters was an illusion that could be shattered by courage and determination. To the slave owners, he became a nightmare figure, a cautionary tale about what could happen if they didn't maintain absolute control, about the dangers of allowing any slave to develop a sense of individual worth or capability. Some historians would later argue that the Abraham Cole legend, whether the details were entirely accurate or had grown through mythologization, played a small but significant role in the growing tensions that led to the Civil War. The story demonstrated that slavery was not the natural and stable system that its defenders claimed, but rather a structure maintained only through overwhelming violence and constant vigilance, one that could be challenged by individuals with sufficient courage and intelligence. Northern abolitionists seized on the tale as evidence of the inherent humanity and capability of enslaved people, while Southern politicians used it to argue for harsher laws and greater enforcement of the slave codes, creating a cycle of oppression and resistance that made peaceful resolution increasingly impossible. What actually happened to Abraham Cole after the failed hunt in the Yazoo Delta remains a mystery wrapped in legend. Some accounts claim he made his way north through the Underground Railroad, eventually reaching Canada where he lived out his days as a free man. Others suggest he remained in the Delta, becoming a protector and guide for other escaped slaves, a kind of guardian spirit of the swamps. There are stories that place him fighting for the Union during the Civil War, using his knowledge of Southern terrain and his personal vendetta against the system of slavery to help federal forces navigate the difficult Delta regions during the Vicksburg Campaign. Each version of his later life carries the weight of hope and imagination, the human need to believe that someone who represented so much and endured so much found some measure of peace and freedom at the end. But perhaps the most powerful legacy of Abraham Cole was not what happened to him personally, but what his story did for the people who heard it. In the years between the failed hunt and the eventual abolition of slavery, every slave who heard about the 7-foot giant understood something fundamental: that resistance was possible, that survival was achievable, that one person refusing to accept their bondage could create ripples that spread far beyond their individual life. The story gave courage to others who would later resist, who would escape, who would fight for their freedom in ways both large and small. It planted seeds of doubt in the minds of slave owners who began to understand that their system required constant and ultimately unsustainable effort to maintain. And it created a legend that would outlive the institution it challenged, becoming part of the complex tapestry of American history. The Yazoo Delta itself became a different place after that summer of 1855. The communities of free blacks and escaped slaves that had existed in hiding became slightly bolder, slightly more willing to help others seeking freedom. The white planters who controlled the region became more fearful, seeing threats in every escaped slave, imagining Abraham Cole's hiding in every patch of swamp. The Delta that had swallowed 100 bounty hunters without a trace became known as a dangerous place, somewhere that even the most confident trackers approached with caution. The cypress trees and Spanish moss, the alligators and water moccasins, all took on a new significance as elements of a landscape that had witnessed something extraordinary, that had become the stage for a confrontation between oppression and resistance that redefined what was possible. Years later, after the Civil War had been fought and won, after slavery had been abolished and Reconstruction had begun its difficult work of reimagining the South, old men would still gather on plantation porches and in town squares to tell the story of the 7-foot giant and the 100 bounty hunters who went into the Delta and never came out. The details would vary with each telling. Some versions emphasized the violence, claiming that Abraham had killed all 100 men with his bare hands. Others focused on the supernatural elements, suggesting that he had made deals with swamp spirits or possessed powers beyond normal human capability. But underneath all the variations, the core of the story remained the same. One enslaved man had refused to accept his bondage, had endured punishments that should have broken him, and had ultimately defeated a force 100 times larger through intelligence, courage, and an unbreakable will to be free. For the descendants of slaves, Abraham Cole became part of a tradition of resistance that helped define African American identity in the South and beyond. His story sat alongside those of other heroes and rebels, people like Nat Turner and Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, individuals who in different ways had challenged the system of slavery and proved that enslaved people were not the passive victims that pro-slavery propaganda had claimed, but rather human beings capable of extraordinary acts of courage and resistance. The story passed through generations, told by grandparents to grandchildren, maintaining its power even as the specific details of 1855 faded into historical uncertainty. The essence of the story, its fundamental truth about human dignity and the costs of oppression, remained relevant long after the institution of slavery had ended. Abraham Cole's legend also influenced how people thought about the geography and ecology of the Deep South. The Yazoo Delta, already a place of mystery and danger in the popular imagination, became inextricably linked with the story of the 7-foot giant. People would look at those swamps and see not just a difficult terrain, but a landscape that had actively participated in the destruction of a 100-strong hunting party, as if the Delta itself had sided with the escaped slave against his pursuers. This perspective, mixing the historical with the mythological, helped create a rich tradition of Southern folklore that recognized the power and mystery of the region's natural environment, treating places like the Delta not as empty wilderness to be conquered, but as living ecosystems with their own character and agency. The weapons that were found scattered throughout the Delta became objects of fascination and horror. Museums would eventually acquire some of them, displaying rifles and knives that had belonged to the bounty hunters as artifacts of a failed mission and a turning point in the history of slavery resistance. The rusted metal and rotted wood carried with them the weight of that summer, physical evidence of a confrontation that most people experienced only through stories. Some plantation families kept the weapons that had belonged to their relatives, passing them down through generations not as trophies, but as sobering reminders of the costs of maintaining a system based on human oppression, warnings about the dangers of underestimating people simply because they were enslaved. In the decades following the Civil War, as America struggled to come to terms with its history of slavery and ongoing racial injustice, the story of Abraham Cole took on new meanings and interpretations. Some white Southerners tried to dismiss it entirely as exaggerated folklore, uncomfortable with any narrative that portrayed an enslaved person as capable of defeating white authority so decisively. Others recognized in the story a kind of morality tale about the inevitable failure of systems built on injustice, a warning that oppression always contains the seeds of its own destruction. For newly freed African Americans building lives in the challenging environment of Reconstruction and then Jim Crow, Abraham Cole remained a symbol of the possibility of resistance, proof that even in the darkest times, individuals could stand up against overwhelming odds and sometimes, against all probability, could win. The mystery of what happened to the bodies of the 100 bounty hunters generated theories that ranged from the mundane to the fantastic. Some suggested that Abraham had killed them and disposed of their bodies in the deep waters of the Delta, where alligators and other scavengers would have eliminated all evidence. Others proposed that many of the hunters had simply deserted, spreading false stories about supernatural encounters to cover their cowardice and choosing to start new lives rather than return home in disgrace. More imaginative theories involved mass graves hidden somewhere in the swamps, or suggested that the hunters had all been killed by diseases or environmental hazards rather than by Abraham directly. But the truth, whatever it was, died with the people who knew it, leaving only speculation and the undeniable fact that 100 armed men had entered the Delta to capture one escaped slave and had not returned. The psychological impact of the failed hunt extended far beyond the immediate participants. Bounty hunters throughout the South became much more cautious about which jobs they would accept, aware that the confidence and sense of invulnerability that had characterized their profession had been shattered in the Yazoo Delta. Some left the profession entirely, troubled by nightmares about vanishing into swamps or facing opponents who refused to behave like the victims they had expected. The market value of escaped slave rewards decreased somewhat, as fewer men were willing to risk the dangers that the Abraham Cole story had highlighted. Plantation owners found it harder to maintain control through fear alone, as the story demonstrated that some slaves would resist even the most severe punishments and that the mechanisms of enforcement could fail catastrophically. Colonel Whitaker's legacy became inextricably tied to his failed pursuit of Abraham Cole. His 3 plantations eventually passed to his heirs, but the family fortune never recovered from the vast sums he had spent trying to capture one escaped slave. Future generations of Whitakers would be known not for the wealth they had accumulated or the land they controlled, but for being the family that the 7-foot giant had defeated. The colonel's obsession served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of letting personal vendettas override practical considerations, about how the need to maintain absolute control could lead to self-destructive behavior. His story became a counterpoint to Abraham's, demonstrating that those who wielded power through oppression were ultimately prisoners of that system as much as the people they enslaved. The communities of escaped slaves and free blacks in the Yazoo Delta that had helped Abraham Cole continued to exist and even grow in the years following the failed hunt. Protected by the Delta's difficult terrain and by the fearful reputation that the region had acquired, these communities developed their own cultures and traditions, mixing African heritage with the realities of life in the southern swamps. They created societies based on cooperation and mutual aid, standing in stark contrast to the hierarchical plantation system that surrounded them. Many of these communities survived well into the 20th century, maintaining traditions and telling stories that connected them back to that summer when Abraham Cole had demonstrated what was possible through courage and resistance. As the decades passed and the original participants in the events died, the story of Abraham Cole and the 100 bounty hunters evolved from contemporary history into legend and mythology. Details that had once been clear became uncertain, facts blended with fiction, and the story took on the characteristics of an oral tradition passed through multiple generations. Yet despite this evolution, certain core elements remained consistent across all versions, suggesting that beneath the embellishments and variations, there was a solid foundation of historical truth. A man called Abraham Cole, known as the 7-foot giant, really had escaped from slavery. A large group of bounty hunters really had entered the Yazoo Delta to capture him. And those hunters really had failed, disappearing into the swamps in a way that terrorized the South and inspired enslaved people throughout the region. The story found new relevance during the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, as African Americans once again confronted systems of oppression and fought for their fundamental human rights. Activists and leaders drew parallels between Abraham Cole's resistance to slavery and their own struggles against segregation and discrimination, finding inspiration in his refusal to accept injustice regardless of the personal costs. The story was retold in churches, at rallies, in homes, connecting the fight for civil rights to a longer tradition of resistance that stretched back through Reconstruction, through slavery, to people like Abraham who had refused to accept bondage even when doing so seemed impossible. The 7-foot giant became a symbol not just of one man's courage, but of the enduring spirit of resistance that had characterized African American responses to oppression throughout history. Historians and scholars eventually attempted to verify the details of the Abraham Cole story, searching through plantation records, newspaper archives, and personal letters from the 1850s. They found fragmentary evidence that supported the broad outlines of the legend. Records from the Whitaker plantation confirmed the existence of a slave named Abraham who was unusually tall and who had been sold to other plantations after severe disciplinary problems. Newspaper accounts from 1855 mentioned a large bounty hunter expedition into the Yazoo Delta that had ended mysteriously, though the articles of the time treated it as a minor incident rather than the significant event it would become in folklore. Letters between plantation owners discussed concerns about escaped slaves and the growing difficulties of controlling their enslaved workforce in the years before the Civil War. But definitive proof, the kind that would satisfy skeptics or confirm every detail of the legend, remained elusive, lost to time and the deliberate destruction of records during and after the war. Perhaps that historical uncertainty is part of what has allowed the story of Abraham Cole to remain powerful across generations. Without complete documentation, the story exists in a space between verified history and inspiring legend, allowing each generation to find in it the meanings and messages most relevant to their own struggles and circumstances. The story can be simultaneously a factual account of historical events and a mythological narrative about human dignity and resistance, a duality that gives it flexibility and enduring relevance. The lack of Abraham's final fate, whether he escaped to freedom or remained in the Delta or met some other end, allows people to imagine the conclusion that gives them the most hope or best serves their understanding of justice. The Yazoo Delta itself remains, still wild and forbidding in many areas, still holding secrets in its waters and swamps. Modern visitors sometimes report feelings of unease when traveling through the deeper parts of the Delta, sensing something in the landscape that goes beyond rational explanation. Local communities still tell stories about the 7-foot giant, and some claim to have seen a massive figure moving through the trees at dusk, a ghost or spirit, or perhaps just the legend made manifest through collective memory and imagination. The Delta has become a place of pilgrimage for some, who come seeking connection to that moment in 1855 when one man proved that systems of oppression could be challenged and defeated, when the impossible became possible through courage and determination. The weapons recovered from the failed hunt gradually disappeared over the years, scattered to private collections or lost or destroyed. But their existence, confirmed by multiple sources from the time period, stands as physical evidence that something extraordinary happened in the Yazoo Delta during that summer. 100 men armed with rifles and knives and accompanied by trained dogs had entered the swamps to capture one escaped slave. Those weapons were found abandoned. The men who had carried them vanished. And Abraham Cole, the 7-foot giant, became a legend that has outlived the institution of slavery itself, a story that continues to inspire and challenge people more than a century and a half after the events that created it. In the end, the story of Abraham Cole transcends the specific historical details of 1855 Mississippi. It speaks to fundamental human truths about dignity, resistance, and the refusal to accept injustice regardless of the personal costs. It demonstrates that systems of oppression, no matter how powerful they seem, contain within them the seeds of their own destruction, that courage and intelligence can triumph over overwhelming force, that one person refusing to accept their bondage can inspire thousands to imagine freedom. The silence that followed the 100 bounty hunters into the Yazoo Delta was not just the absence of sound, but the presence of something profound, the moment when a legend was born and the old certainties of the slave system began their inevitable collapse. The immediate aftermath of the failed hunt created chaos across the Mississippi Delta region. Families of the missing bounty hunters descended on the area demanding answers, explanations, bodies to bury. Some wives became widows without confirmation of their husbands' deaths, trapped in a legal and emotional limbo that prevented them from remarrying or collecting insurance. Children grew up hearing stories about fathers who had gone into the swamps and never returned, creating a generation haunted by the mystery of what had happened during those 3 terrible weeks. The authorities, embarrassed by their inability to explain the disappearances of so many men, launched investigations that ultimately produced nothing but frustration and speculation. Sheriffs questioned the few hunters who had returned with their minds shattered, but these men could provide nothing coherent, only fragments about darkness and silence and a presence that seemed to exist everywhere simultaneously. Colonel Whitaker's decline accelerated after the failed hunt became widely known. His peers in the plantation aristocracy began to distance themselves from him, seeing his obsession with Abraham Cole as a dangerous fixation that had cost lives and accomplished nothing. Business relationships that had sustained his empire for decades began to fray as other planters questioned his judgment and his stability. His wife, Margaret Whitaker, a woman who had maintained the facade of plantation respectability for 30 years, finally confronted him about the madness that had consumed him. She told him that Abraham Cole had defeated him not through violence, but simply by surviving, by refusing to be broken, by demonstrating that the absolute power the colonel believed he wielded was an illusion. The confrontation left Whitaker speechless and broken, forcing him to confront truths about himself and the system he had devoted his life to maintaining that he had always worked hard to avoid. The slave quarters on plantations throughout the region transformed in subtle but significant ways after the story of the failed hunt spread. The fear that had always governed these spaces began to be balanced by something else, a quiet confidence that came from knowing that resistance was possible and that the mechanisms of enforcement were not infallible. Overseers noticed changes in how slaves carried themselves, small acts of defiance that multiplied across dozens of interactions. The efficiency of plantation operations began to decline slightly, just enough to be noticeable, but not enough to identify specific culprits. Songs emerged in the quarters, spirituals that seemed to be about biblical deliverance, but that everyone understood were actually about Abraham Cole and the 100 bounty hunters who had gone into the Delta and never returned. These songs spread from plantation to plantation, becoming part of the cultural fabric of enslaved communities, preserving the story and its lessons for future generations. Nathaniel Price's family tried for years to determine what had happened to their patriarch. His son, Robert Price, inherited his father's business and spent the better part of a decade searching for information about those final weeks in the Delta. Robert interviewed the returned hunters, hired private investigators, even traveled to the Delta himself to explore the areas where his father had last been seen. But every lead ended in frustration. Every potential witness either knew nothing or claimed supernatural explanations that seemed designed to prevent further investigation. Robert eventually concluded that his father had met some fate in those swamps that would never be fully understood, and he abandoned the slave-catching profession entirely, unable to shake the feeling that his father's legendary career had ended not in a moment of defeat, but in something far more mysterious and terrifying. The medical implications of Abraham's survival of the punishments he endured became a subject of quiet discussion among the few doctors who treated enslaved populations. The 100 lashes over 3 days should have killed him, or at minimum left him crippled and broken. The infection that must have followed should have led to blood poisoning and death. The time in the punishment cells should have damaged his body beyond recovery. Yet Abraham had not only survived these ordeals, but had apparently retained enough physical strength to move through the Delta, evade or eliminate pursuers, and maintain the kind of intense physical activity that survival in that environment required. Some doctors theorized that Abraham's unusual size and strength provided biological advantages that allowed him to endure what would kill smaller men. Others suggested that his mental resilience had somehow translated into physical durability, that his refusal to accept defeat had literally kept his body functioning when it should have failed. These discussions happened quietly, in private spaces, because they raised uncomfortable questions about the fundamental humanity of enslaved people and their capacity for resilience that challenged the ideological foundations of slavery itself. The children who grew up hearing stories about Abraham Cole and the 100 bounty hunters developed a particular relationship with the concept of courage and resistance. In the slave quarters, parents would tell their children the story as a kind of moral instruction, teaching them that dignity and self-respect mattered more than survival, that there were things worth fighting for even when the odds seemed impossible. These children internalized lessons about the importance of education, community solidarity, and psychological resilience that would serve them well through the remaining years of slavery and into the tumultuous period of Reconstruction. Some of these children would themselves become leaders in their communities, drawing on the example of Abraham Cole to guide their own decisions about when to resist, when to accommodate, and how to maintain hope in situations that seemed hopeless. The legend became a form of cultural transmission, passing values and strategies for survival from one generation to the next. The economic impact of the failed hunt extended beyond the immediate costs of the reward and the search operation. The insurance industry, which had begun to develop policies covering the value of enslaved people, started reassessing their risk calculations after the Abraham Cole incident. The possibility that slaves could successfully resist capture, combined with the apparently significant dangers involved in attempting to recapture them, meant that the actual value of enslaved people as secured assets was less certain than the industry had assumed. Premium rates for plantation owners increased, particularly for those who owned slaves with any history of resistance or escape attempts. This created additional financial pressure on the institution of slavery at a time when its economic viability was already being questioned in many quarters, adding to the complex array of factors that would eventually lead to the Civil War and the end of the peculiar institution. The ecological knowledge that Abraham demonstrated during his time in the Delta became legendary among the communities that helped him. The descendants of those free blacks and escaped slaves who lived in the swamps would tell stories for generations about how the 7-foot giant could read the Delta like others read books, how he understood the relationship between water levels and season, between animal behavior and weather patterns, between the subtle signs in vegetation and the presence of threats or opportunities. This knowledge, they explained, came partly from the time Abraham spent with their communities, but also from something deeper, an instinctive connection to the natural world that slavery had tried to suppress, but could never completely eliminate. These stories emphasized that survival required more than just physical strength or courage. It required intelligence, observation, and a willingness to learn from the environment and from people who understood it better than you did. The legal ramifications of the failed hunt were minimal, but symbolically significant. No charges were ever filed in connection with the disappearance of the bounty hunters because technically no crimes could be proven. The absence of bodies meant no murder charges could be brought, and the circumstantial evidence that Abraham Cole had been involved in their disappearances could not meet the legal standards of the time, particularly given the unreliable testimony of the few returned hunters whose mental state made them questionable witnesses. This legal vacuum created a strange situation where everyone knew what had happened, or at least had strong suspicions, but no official record existed to confirm it. For opponents of slavery, this legal ambiguity became a useful talking point, an example of how the slave system created situations where normal legal processes broke down and where the violence inherent in the institution could not be properly addressed through courts and legislation. The spiritual dimensions of Abraham's story became increasingly important as the legend evolved over time. In churches and prayer meetings, preachers would draw parallels between Abraham Cole and biblical figures who had stood against impossible odds through faith and divine assistance. They would compare him to David facing Goliath, to Daniel in the lion's den, to Moses leading people to freedom. These religious interpretations added layers of meaning to the story, transforming it from a simple tale of physical resistance into a narrative about spiritual warfare, about good confronting evil, about the ways that faith could provide strength beyond normal human capacity. The irony that masters had used Christianity as a tool of control, preaching obedience and acceptance, while slaves used the same religion to inspire resistance and hope, was not lost on anyone. Abraham Cole became a Christ-like figure in some versions of the story, a man who suffered for the sins of others, who sacrificed his own safety to prove a larger point about human dignity, and whose example provided a path forward for those still trapped in bondage. The women who had been enslaved on the same plantations as Abraham remembered him in ways that added texture and humanity to the legend. They recalled his gentleness despite his size, the way he would help with tasks that were beneath his official duties, his patience when teaching children to read, his respectful interactions with female slaves in an environment where women were constantly vulnerable to sexual exploitation. These memories, shared in quiet conversations away from white observers, presented a portrait of Abraham that balanced the fearsome warrior of the bounty hunter story with a complete human being who possessed compassion, intelligence, and a moral code that governed his actions even in the most difficult circumstances. The women who remembered him understood that his resistance to slavery was rooted not in hatred or anger, but in a deep conviction about the fundamental rights and worth of all human beings, himself included. The agricultural techniques and survival strategies that Abraham learned and taught during his years in slavery found new applications after his escape. The communities in the Delta that sheltered him adopted some of his innovations in farming, fishing, and resource management, creating more sustainable and productive systems that allowed them to thrive in their marginal environment. These practical applications of knowledge demonstrated that Abraham's intelligence extended far beyond the dramatic confrontation with the bounty hunters, that he possessed a broad range of skills and insights that made him valuable to his community in peacetime as well as in conflict. This practical legacy, less dramatic than the legend but perhaps equally important, helped sustain families and communities through the difficult decades that followed, providing them with the means to maintain independence and self-sufficiency in a hostile world. The psychological trauma experienced by the hunters who returned from the Delta with their minds shattered became a subject of fascination and horror in the wider community. Doctors attempted to treat these men using the limited psychiatric knowledge available in the 1850s, typically resorting to rest cures, sedatives, and the hope that time would heal mental wounds the way it healed physical ones. But many of these men never fully recovered, spending the rest of their lives haunted by memories they couldn't fully articulate, jumping at shadows, unable to sleep peacefully, convinced that something was following them even decades after they had left the Delta. Their conditions served as ongoing warnings about the psychological costs of the hunt, living testaments to the idea that hunting Abraham Cole had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate physical dangers of the swamp environment. The documentation that survived from the period, fragmentary as it was, provided historians with just enough material to confirm the broad outlines of the Abraham Cole story, while leaving enormous gaps that speculation and legend filled. Plantation ledgers recorded the purchase and sale of a slave matching Abraham's description, though they used different names at different times, suggesting the possibility that he had been called Abraham at one plantation but given other names elsewhere. Newspaper articles from the Delta region in 1855 mentioned the disappearance of a large hunting party, but provided few details and treated the incident as a local curiosity rather than a significant historical event. Personal letters between plantation owners referenced concerns about a troublesome giant slave and the problems his escape had created for plantation security, but these letters were typically vague, perhaps because the writers were reluctant to document their failures too explicitly. This scattered documentation created a historical puzzle that researchers would continue to investigate for generations, each new discovery adding a piece, but never quite completing the full picture. The impact of Abraham's story on the development of the Underground Railroad was subtle but real. Conductors and safehouse operators in the Mississippi region found that escaped slaves who reached them were better prepared, both psychologically and practically, than had been common before the Abraham Cole legend spread. These escapees understood that successful flight required not just the courage to leave, but the intelligence to evade pursuit, the physical endurance to survive difficult journeys, and the mental resilience to overcome obstacles and setbacks. They had learned from Abraham's example that resistance was possible, but that it required preparation, that freedom was achievable, but that the price was high, that survival in a hostile environment demanded every resource they could muster. This shift in understanding and preparation made the Underground Railroad more effective, reducing the capture rate and increasing the number of slaves who successfully reached freedom in the North. The artistic representations of Abraham Cole that emerged in later generations reflected changing attitudes towards slavery and resistance. Early depictions, created during or shortly after the Civil War, tended to emphasize his physical stature and strength, portraying him as almost superhuman in his capabilities. Later artistic interpretations, particularly those created during the Civil Rights Movement, focused more on his dignity and determination, presenting him as a fully human figure whose resistance came from moral conviction rather than just physical prowess. Modern artistic treatments often emphasize the complexity of his situation, the psychological costs of resistance, and the communities that supported him, trying to move beyond simplistic hero narratives to explore the full humanity of everyone involved in the story. These evolving artistic interpretations demonstrate how each generation finds different aspects of Abraham's story relevant to their own struggles and circumstances, keeping the legend alive by continuously reinterpreting it through contemporary lenses. The military tactics that Abraham appeared to have used during the Delta hunt, inferred from the pattern of hunter disappearances and the accounts of survivors, suggested a level of strategic thinking that impressed even his enemies. He had apparently employed classic guerrilla warfare techniques, avoiding direct confrontation when possible, using terrain to his advantage, targeting isolated individuals rather than confronting large groups, and creating psychological pressure through unpredictability and the atmosphere of constant threat. Military historians who later studied the incident recognized parallels between Abraham's tactics and those used by successful guerrilla fighters throughout history, from ancient times through modern conflicts. This recognition raised uncomfortable questions about the intelligence and military capability of enslaved people, about what they might achieve if they chose organized resistance rather than individual escape or accommodation. These questions haunted slave owners during the final years before the Civil War, contributing to an atmosphere of paranoia and fear that made peaceful resolution of the slavery question increasingly unlikely. The environmental conditions in the Yazoo Delta during that summer of 1855 played a crucial but often overlooked role in the story. The region was experiencing particularly high water levels that year, with spring floods extending well into the summer months, creating a landscape that was even more challenging than usual. The heat was oppressive, with temperatures regularly exceeding 95 degrees and humidity levels that made breathing difficult and physical exertion exhausting. The mosquito population was extraordinary even by Delta standards, creating clouds of insects that could drive men to distraction. These conditions, which Abraham had adapted to through his months in the region while the bounty hunters encountered them for the first time, gave the escaped slaves significant advantages. He understood how to find potable water sources, how to avoid areas where quicksand was likely, how to recognize the signs of dangerous wildlife, and how to manage his energy in the oppressive heat. The hunters, despite their professional experience, were operating in an environment that was fundamentally hostile to their purposes, and their inability to adapt to those conditions contributed significantly to their failure. The role of disease in the failed hunt remained a subject of speculation. The Delta was notorious for malaria, yellow fever, and other illnesses that particularly affected people who were not acclimated to the region. Some theories about the missing hunters suggested that disease had killed many of them, their bodies succumbing to illness in the swamps and then being consumed by the environment's natural processes of decomposition. This explanation had the advantage of requiring no supernatural elements and no mass killings, but it couldn't fully account for the pattern of disappearances or the testimony of those who returned. Most likely, disease was one of several factors that contributed to the hunt's failure, weakening the hunters and making them more vulnerable to other dangers, whether those dangers came from Abraham himself, from the environment, or from the psychological stress they were experiencing. The combination of physical illness, mental exhaustion, environmental hazards, and the constant threat of attack created a perfect storm of challenges that even experienced hunters could not overcome. The transformation of Abraham Cole from historical figure to cultural symbol accelerated during the decades following the Civil War. As the United States struggled with the question of what freedom would mean for formerly enslaved people, Abraham's story provided a framework for thinking about dignity, self-determination, and the psychological aftermath of slavery. Freedmen who had known bondage understood that the chains on their bodies had been broken, but that the mental and emotional impacts of slavery would take generations to overcome. Abraham's example, of a man who had refused to let slavery define him even while he was enslaved, offered a model for maintaining psychological freedom even in circumstances of physical oppression. This lesson resonated through the difficult years of Reconstruction and into the Jim Crow era, when African Americans faced new forms of oppression designed to replicate many aspects of slavery without formally reinstating it. The scattered communities in the Yazoo Delta that had helped Abraham developed a particular pride in their connection to his story. These settlements, some of which survived well into the 20th century before being absorbed into larger towns or abandoned due to economic pressures, maintained oral traditions that preserved details about Abraham that never made it into the wider legend. They remembered specific conversations, particular kindnesses he had shown, the ways he had contributed to their communities during his time among them. These intimate memories humanized the larger-than-life figure of the legend, reminding people that Abraham Cole had been a real person with fears and hopes and flaws, not just a symbol or an archetype. The preservation of these personal memories helped ensure that Abraham's story remained connected to human reality even as it took on mythological proportions in the broader culture. The political implications of the Abraham Cole story extended far beyond the immediate context of slavery resistance. Abolitionists in the North seized on the legend as evidence that enslaved people were fully capable of sophisticated resistance when given the opportunity, that the institution of slavery survived not because enslaved people accepted it, but because it was maintained through overwhelming force and systematic oppression. Pro-slavery advocates tried to dismiss or minimize the story, arguing that it was exaggerated folklore or that Abraham Cole, if he had existed at all, was an exceptional case that said nothing about the general capabilities of enslaved populations. These competing interpretations of the same events revealed the fundamental divide in American society over questions of race, capability, and human rights, a divide that would only be partially resolved through the Civil War, and that continues to echo in American culture and politics to this day. The technological changes that accelerated during the late 19th and early 20th centuries created new ways for Abraham's story to spread beyond the oral traditions and written accounts that had initially preserved it. The expansion of literacy among African Americans during Reconstruction meant that more people could read and share written versions of the legend. The development of phonograph technology allowed the spirituals and songs that referenced Abraham Cole to be recorded and distributed widely. Later, radio broadcasts and eventually television would bring the story to audiences who might never have encountered it through traditional channels. Each new medium adapted the story to its particular requirements, sometimes emphasizing drama and action, sometimes focusing on the moral and spiritual dimensions, but always preserving the core narrative of one man's resistance against overwhelming odds and his ultimate triumph over those who sought to enslave him. The descendants of Colonel Whitaker struggled with their family legacy in ways that reflected broader Southern difficulties in coming to terms with the history of slavery. Some chose to distance themselves from their ancestors' obsession with Abraham Cole, viewing it as an embarrassing episode that revealed the moral bankruptcy of the slave system. Others tried to rehabilitate the colonel's reputation, arguing that he had been a product of his times and that his actions, however misguided they might seem in retrospect, were consistent with the values and legal framework of antebellum Mississippi. A few became active in reconciliation efforts, working to acknowledge the harm their family had participated in and to contribute to racial justice in contemporary society. These varied responses demonstrated that the Abraham Cole story continued to challenge and provoke thought generations after the events themselves, forcing people to grapple with questions about responsibility, legacy, and the long shadows cast by historical injustice. The archaeological investigations that eventually took place in the Yazoo Delta during the late 20th and early 21st centuries sought to find physical evidence that might confirm or deny various aspects of the Abraham Cole legend. Researchers used ground-penetrating radar, metal detectors, and systematic surveying to search for remains of the camps that Price had established, for the weapons that had been abandoned, for any trace of the 100 bounty hunters who had disappeared. Some artifacts were recovered, including rusted rifle parts, corroded belt buckles, and other items consistent with the time period in the story. But despite extensive searching, no mass graves were found, no cluster of human remains that would explain what had happened to all those missing men. The archaeological evidence, like the historical documentation, was suggestive but not definitive, confirming that something extraordinary had happened in that location during that time period, but leaving the full truth tantalizingly out of reach. The educational curricula that developed in African American communities during the 20th century often included Abraham Cole's story as part of teaching about resistance to slavery and the long history of Black Americans fighting for their freedom and dignity. Students learned about Abraham alongside Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Frederick Douglass, and others who had refused to accept bondage, gaining an understanding that resistance had taken many forms and that the struggle for freedom had been long and multifaceted. These educational efforts helped ensure that new generations understood their heritage not as one of passive victimization, but as one of active resistance and resilience. The story of the 7-foot giant served as a reminder that enslaved people had never simply accepted their bondage, that they had fought back in ways both large and small, and that the eventual end of slavery came not just through the actions of white abolitionists and politicians, but through the constant pressure of resistance from enslaved people themselves. Abraham Cole, the 7-foot giant, may have been one man, but his story belongs to everyone who has ever fought against oppression, who has refused to accept injustice, who has stood up for their humanity when the world tried to deny it. His legend lives on not in documented records or verified facts, but in the inspiration it provides, in the hope it offers, in its demonstration that resistance is possible and that sometimes, against all odds, that resistance can succeed. The 100 bounty hunters entered the Delta confident in their numbers, in their weapons, and their righteousness. Only silence followed them because they encountered something they couldn't understand or defeat, a man who had endured everything the system of slavery could inflict and had emerged not broken but strengthened, not defeated but victorious, not a slave but free in the only way that truly matters, in his mind, in his spirit, in his unbreakable determination to be recognized as fully human regardless of what anyone else believed. His story echoes across the generations, a testament to the power of the human spirit, a warning to those who would oppress others, and a source of hope for all who struggle against injustice in their own times and places. The 7-foot giant walked into legend that summer in the Yazoo Delta, and the silence that followed 100 hunters into those swamps speaks louder than any documentation ever could, telling a truth that transcends historical verification and touches something fundamental about dignity, courage, and the eternal human quest for freedom.